at some ES6 questions. Let's pop up JSBin is a place to start. And first, let's do something that's non-ES6, right? When we want to create a function, what we could do is we could create this function, foo, and we could go over here, and when we call foo, we're going to say console.log bar. And we could call foo, right? So we can end up running this, and we get bar, will end up coming out. Now, this exact same thing with an arrow function would look like this. Let's comment this out. And again, if this browser understands arrow functions, we might be fine, although it's perfectly legitimate to go over here and say ES6 and Babel to make sure that we're fine. So if I go over here and I say const foo, this is the equivalent of, and let's actually make it a little more interesting. I'm going to go back a step. Let's make it so that this function returns something, and we'll go over here and we'll specify this is going to return bar. And let's actually pass it something. So if we go over here and we do console.log and we call foo, actually it's showing up. You know what my problem is? I always run into this, is that it's got some old stuff in the console when I had an error. So I always do console.clear, right? Bar is, X is undefined. And if we go over here and I pass in this, I end up getting that. Now, if we're going to do this with ES6 syntax using arrow functions, comment this out. Okay, so here we would use const because this is something that's not changing. Okay, I assume we're not going to assign another variable to this. And I go over here and I specify that this is going to be a function, and I'm going to create a block here, and I'm going to return bar plus x. And I'll put an x here, and I end up getting that same result. And if I wanted to, just to sort of do a little more ES6 syntax, see if this works, I could say bar $x. Okay? And that'll end up working as well. So that is really what the fat arrow really ends up doing. Now, there's another thing that you could do with the fat arrow. If, in fact, you're a one-liner, and you don't really need these braces because you're on one line, you could get very terse by doing this. Let me close this down so I have some room to work here. And what this allows me to do, it's almost just like saying, hey, look, I'm going to call this function, and what will happen under the covers is it will evaluate this expression, and since it's a one-liner, it'll actually return that value. So you end up using blocks when you have multiple lines, okay? If, in fact, you just have one line, okay, it'll end up running that line of code, and it'll return whatever that ends up returning. So just for the sake of argument, I'll throw this out. I'm going to close this console. What do you think would happen if I did this? What do I expect to see when I open up the console? Not quite. Remember, what's going to happen is that this is going to return what this function is. What does console.log return? Undefined, okay? Or nothing. So what ends up happening here, again, you have to sort of break this down. Console.log ends up writing out to the console, right? But after that, we get undefined. And the reason is that it calls console.log, and it sees what console.log returned. That's what ends up getting returned. And nothing ends up getting returned. But the bottom line is, and this is pretty common, very often, you might just have these functions that, don't do all that much, and they're these one-liners, and it just makes this pretty pleasant to look at. All right, so we could go in here, and we could end up doing this. Now, let's look at one other variation of this. Let's say that we have, let's create a class. We'll examine the fat arrow a little bit, what I meant by how this ends up working and how you sort of get around it by using the fat arrow. By the way, Jordan, right?
Yeah.
Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, a little bit. So parentheses, the x, that just shows that x is...
These two things are exactly equivalent. In fact, if you turn this into ES5 code, this is what will end up happening. It's really the exact equivalent thing. It's just declaring a function. It's just a different way to declare a function, and the context is different, but you're not going to see that here.
So the syntax is you have to do the $sign and then curly brackets?
No. This is two different things. Let me actually make it totally similar. That's just basically for interpolating a string. So, I mean, really, if we want to compare apples to apples, these are the exact same things. Okay? Now, let's just make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complicated. Hey. Hello. Whatever. Okay, so let's go over here and let's make sure that we actually have ES6 syntax. And let's just look a little bit at the fat arrow function. So if we end up going over here and I create a class, okay, and I'm going to call this foo. And let's use the constructor that we ended up getting before. Actually, let's actually do it let's work in the order that we would have sort of learned it. Let's go and actually create this, and we'll create this function foo. And let's just say that we're going to pass to our function foo a collection of bars. Let's say that those bars are just some collection of numbers, let's say. We'll go over here and we'll specify this dot bars equals whatever bars were passed in. So that means that if I say f equals new foo 1, 2, 3, and I say console.log f dot bars, I should see the string. I mean the thank you. So if I end up running this, and I should see that I just get the values 1, 2, 3. Okay? Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I want to do something a little bit different here. Let's say that what I really want to do is I want to loop over each of these values of bar, and I want to add 1 to them. Okay? So let's just go over here, and I'm going to say foo.prototype add 1 is a function. And I'm just going to pass it a number. And I'm going to return that number plus 1. Right? Seems reasonable? And let's say that I end up going through this a little bit differently. I'm going to specify, I'll do it the long way. I'll say this dot bars equals an empty array, and I'm going to loop over these bars. I'll say for I equals 0, I less than this dot, I less than bars dot length, I plus plus. And every time that I end up going in here, I'll specify this dot bars dot push, this add one bars I. I think I'm matched up here. I think that looks okay. Let's run that, see what happens. Okay, we get 2, 3, and 4. Seems reasonable, right? Nothing fancy, kind of silly, but sort of makes sense. People hate doing this. They hate the fact that they have to iterate over something and they have to use this value of I for any number of reasons. That's why one of the things that was put in ES5 was the ability, let's just comment this out. And we'll go over here and we'll do a, we'll use a couple of different array methods. We'll specify this dot bars for each, okay? This takes a callback function. We'll be looping over each of our bars. Again, all this is doing is that this is the exact same thing. We could write a for each. We could write this for each pretty easily if we wanted to. Okay? We don't have to. Okay? It's already in the language. It wasn't always in the language, by the way. There were third-party libraries that did this for you, and you ended up using those third-party libraries because, again, you were always iterating, and it seemed pretty natural. Why do I have to keep track of this counter? Can't something else just basically iterate over my items for me, and I'll give you the callback? I want to do something with each of my items. And every time I get in here, for the moment, I'm going to go over here, and what I'm going to specify is this dot bars dot push, and I'm going to push this dot add one bar. Okay? Looks fairly similar to this code up here, right? Problem is when I go to run it, I end up getting nothing back. Now, actually, the reason why I'm getting nothing back is this. I really should be getting an error. Okay? And I end up getting an error. The reason why I end up getting an error is that when you end up using using code where you're specifying a callback function, okay? You're specifying a callback function. You're not in charge of what the context is inside that callback function. We expect inside this callback function, this will point to our object the same way it did up here, but it doesn't, okay? If we were to go into our callback function, I'm going to get rid of this error, and I'll go in here, and I say console.log, just to see that this is working and it's not breaking anymore. Let's run this, okay? But if I were to go in here and say console.log this, I get a pretty big thing here. But believe it or not, what this is this is the reason why it's big. This is your big daddy, your big global object. This is your window object. This is your environment, basically. Okay? So how do I handle that? I just gave a clue. How do I handle that? The way that I handle that is nothing prevents me up here from saying that equals this. Okay? Again, references. What's that pointing to up here? Okay? Up here, that is pointing to this. This is the object that we're creating. We're in the right context. And if I end up coming down here, and I go over here, and I change this to that bars push, that add one, I'm totally back in business. Okay? Now, fat arrows solve this problem. Okay? Fat arrows end up solving this problem. By the way, I'll give you one other way to solve it. Okay? Very often, in functions that have callbacks, they'll give you an option and say, hey, look, do you want to control the context? Not all of them do, but the for each does. And so if I didn't want to use that, because this is a little hacky. I mean, it used to be the only way you could do it, so shouldn't really say that. I got a lot of code that probably does that. But if instead I did this, if you look at the documentation for each, unless I'm forgetting something, this should also do the same thing, okay? So again, under the covers, you know what it's doing? Doing the same thing I just did, right? Creating some variable and capturing the contents, okay? This is one reason why people sort of like ES6. If I go over here and I'm going to modify this, I'm going to go to ES6. And I'm going to comment this out. And I'll go over here and I'll specify that I've got a class foo that's going to accept some bars. I'll put in a constructor. Oh, excuse me, it doesn't go there. That's just the class. The constructor is here. And for the constructor, I'll specify that I'm taking a collection of bars. I'll also have an add1 function, which takes a num and returns num plus 1. And when I end up going into this class, what I'm going to do is I'll specify this dot bars equals an empty array. And I could specify this dot bars for each. And here I'm going to use my arrow function. The other thing with the arrow function, when you're doing it here, since I'm only looping over one item, I could put this in parentheses like that, but when you just have one item, a lot of times that's left off. It's assumed here. So for every bar that I end up getting here, I'm going to simply specify this bars push this add1 bar.
Isn't that bars? No, it's bar. You want to push each bar.
Yeah, I'm pushing this value. I'm adding 1. Let's just see if I'm missing a quote. Let's just make sure we're right. Let's add 2 just to see that it's definitely working.
Is the element.
Am I losing it here?
The class, do you have the parent after the foo?
No, yes, good point. And you know what? It's not showing me much of an error here. Let's see. Okay, so this is actually working. Probably the reason why that's a little bit delayed is that it's running through some transpilation in order to do it. Probably not. It's probably just using it's probably being transpiled just in time on the client.
Can you just say a few words about when you use the scope braces and introducing a parameter you're passing into a constructor, as we had done with DB?
The object is a DB constructor.
So it's like
Oh.
it's a constant.
So, okay, so in other words, are you asking when you would do this? First of all, before we do that, let's just be clear about one thing. Notice I didn't have to worry about context here. And the reason is that fat arrows don't change the context. Inside the fat arrow, the this is the same as it was outside the fat arrow. So when using ES6, you don't have a lot of that's, and this is running around.
Before we move on to the object for that arrow, let's say this was in a map function, and you have to return something from a map. You don't have to do a return statement that's like a one-liner with arrow, right?
Yeah, in fact, let's actually do this even in a better way. This is just so we're sort of clear about some of the ES6 stuff. This is kind of silly to do. Why don't we just do this? Why are we doing that? Why not just take bars, and why don't we map over the bars, and we'll have a bar. And why bother doing the push? Why don't we just set bars to, and this would be a hell of a lot more concise. And under the covers, it's pretty much doing the same thing, right? So here we've got our add 1, and this should give us the same result. Let's just double check that I don't have an error here. Go back to 1. This is weird that you don't see these errors when you're doing this. Let me just see what is happening here. So we're doing bars.map 1, 2, and 3. Should be 2, 3, 4. Let's say console.log this.bars. Yeah, there's a hell of a delay on this thing. That's what the problem is. Let me just throw one more thing out. By the way, map is great if you wanted to, really. You could use reduce, too, if you want. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Usually reduce, you're getting one item. But you could use reduce. And you could use reduce for anything, really. Reduce from, you just start out with an array and just add in whatever you want to add in, okay? Reduce, you could end up using for everything, but why bother? So again, when to use each one. If you just want to iterate, for each. If you want to basically take an array, get a new array with the same length, map. If you want to reduce it to something else, use reduce. Okay? So let's talk a little bit. I think, Ilya, you were talking about this. When do you end up using this? Okay. So what this ends up doing is that what it basically allows you to do is pluck out what's being passed in here. So the assumption is, if I use this, the assumption is, if I'm looking at this code, what it says to me is that when I call this code, I need to pass in an object with a property of bars. Okay? That's the only way it'll work. Okay? So if I call this code, I need to call this code by passing in a property of bars, and in fact, that bars property that I pass in better be an array, because or else I wouldn't be able to map over it. So my code is not going to work here. But if I go over here and instead of just saying this, I go over here and I put in bars, and I go back and I run this, I should get the same result. Let's just make sure we are. Again, this is kind of painfully slow. Wait a couple of seconds.
With the Acme, right? The Acme would pass an array. Users, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
With Acme,
it was
we
an
did
array of
this.
objects.
It was an array of objects instead of an array of.
So in this case, you put you had those property bars. The other thing, you didn't have any properties. It was just an array.
No, it was actually an object. It was. We could go back and take a look at it, but it was an object with a key of users. I think. I thought I did it that way. Maybe I didn't.
Name. It was name.
No,
Get
so
the name of the person.
you use the scope, the basics.
Yeah, same thing. Right here.
So these named functions, this error function.
This is. It's the exact same thing. Look, I'm passing in.
Let's see, the property here is if you look at the property of users, we have name as a property. Users is the name of the I guess the array.
Well, okay. So here's the. You're talking about two different things. One of the things that you have with ES6 syntax, and maybe this would help. Does this seem a little more clear to you? Okay? If I take this out, it's the exact same thing. ES6 says if you give me an object, it acts under an assumption. That one's, once you start to use it, you're like, oh, God, thank God, I don't have to put this on both sides of it. It looks at it and says, okay, this doesn't have a key and a value. I've got a variable. I'm going to assume the name of the key is the name of the variable.
But it was the value of that key
It's going to be this
is an
array.
of objects.
That's correct. Okay? But the key, by the way, keys are always what? Always.
Strings.
Okay? Try to put another object in, doesn't matter. Always a string, even if you put an array in as a key. Okay? If you try to do that, it'll convert that array to a string. It'll be a weird looking key. Always a string. It's important. Okay? So, again, this is Again, some ES6 of, destructuring here. By the way, I could have gotten the same effect here just to show you this. If I went over here and I said const bars, and I went in here, I could get away with the same thing that I had here by just putting in bars. Alex, does that make sense? I mean, just look at it and see if there's no key in value. It's going to end up basically just using that key with the same name as the variable.
So what exactly do scope braces do right now? They tell to interpret whatever's between them as a constant, or what do they?
Okay, now when you say it, okay, when you say what do those braces mean, be specific about what line you're talking about, because they do things on different lines.
It begins with bar f equals.
Okay, so what this does is these braces here are very simple. These braces here say I'm creating an object literal. That's all. Those braces say object literal. Okay? In ES6, when you have an object literal, you have keys and values. Okay? If it just sees a value here, it assumes that the name of the key is the same name as the variable.
Got it. But here we have an array and no object.
Here you have an array. That array is an object. Right? You have an array of integers, but who cares? Whether you have an array of integers, an array of objects, still an array.
And it still makes sense to say bars in the scope brackets because is there a property of the bars array that's called bars? So the constant is bars. Does bars have a property called bars? Would be accessing?
No, I mean, it's very simple. In terms of the JavaScript compiler, the JavaScript compiler sees this and does this. Simple as that.
Which doesn't quite make sense in this context, right?
I mean, it does to me. I don't see why it doesn't make sense. I mean, again, if I was going to pass multiple properties in here, okay, and maybe I want to basically, what I would call destructuring those properties, I'd want to pull those values out. I'll throw this out just for the sake of argument. I'm going to put another value here, add amount of 3. Okay? So, by the way, this is totally legitimate. I could go in here. And I'm going to say add amount of 3. And let's make sure that this is working. Okay? And I'm going to go over here, and I'll modify this, and I'll pull out bars, and I also have the ability to pull out add amount. And if I wanted to, I could come over here and say this dot add amount equals add amount. And instead of saying add 1, I could add this add amount, which would be legit, and it would end up adding that amount. So it just, whether or not you use this or not, I could get this same result by not using this, in which case I would go over here, and I would say object, and I would say object equals this dot add amount equals object add amount, and bars object dot bars. But the destructuring is kind of nice because it's very clear what your object is going to look like, what you need coming in. Okay? Right off the bat, someone could look at the definition and see what it is that they're going to get. Again, the order doesn't matter. Bars, add amount, and switch this back. And that should work as well. Good. One last question, and then we've got to move on.
But in the example you did, it saved the variable you gave it. So if you go back to your test code you gave us, see, you never actually make the same user. So when you're in Acme TV, the object that gets passed is an object with key users. That's that array. So if you change that constant to users 1, wouldn't your key on that object now be users 1?
Yeah, this wouldn't work. You mean do that?
And then if you take AcmeDB users, see how you have it brackets users.
Mhm.
And if you need that users one,
Yeah.
your code wouldn't work because the object you get, the key on that object would no longer be users one.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to pull out a key, it better be the key that's passed in here. If I do users one here, and I do users one here, how would this possibly know that, how could this work with that value as users? Again, the whole point of it is that you're pulling out a value from an object. If all of a sudden the object that I pass in doesn't have a user's property, how could I pull out a user's property?
Yeah, but like the point I'm trying to get across is the variable name ends up being your key in
Yeah.
the key constructor. Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, the variable ends up being your key in this object, right? The variable name is the key in this object, and if you're going to use this object, you better put the right,
Yeah.
you better be pulling out the right value, right? Again, you can look at it and say, look, you're seeing, again, you're on the bubble, right? You went through foundations without looking at the ES6 very, very easily. We could wait on ES6 and do it a little bit longer down the line. I think you see a little bit here, you see a little bit of why the need is, they use it, and then when we go into it, I think naturally, if you start writing some ES6, you're going to want to write more ES6 because it's just easier to do this, you know, and someone else who's looking at your code, if you're pairing with someone, they know the ES6 better than you, they're like, hey, make that a little bit nicer. You know, you have the users colon users. Looks redundant, right? And again, the other thing that, you know, something that's very common is that if you're passing some kind of object in here, like we're doing, you know, here, it's nice to know what that object is supposed to look like. So this tells us that we're being sort of clear in the constructor. We're expecting an object with the key users.
And no other key.
Well, there could be other keys we just don't care about. It's not going to break. Okay? If someone passes us an object with a key of users and also a key of foo, so be it, we just don't care. Right?
If you use a for loop, you can break it. Can you break out of a for each statement or a backward?
You know, it's not, I don't, this is a very good question. Breaking out of a for each, can you return something from a for each? That's one thing about a for loop that you can do. You end up returning from a for each, you end up returning. Can you return, excuse me, with a regular for loop, you could return out of it. It's a good question. I don't do it that often because usually when I end up using the for each, I'm iterating over something. Can you iterate over it earlier or break the loop? There probably is a way to do it, but I'm not aware of it. I haven't run into that, but it's a very good question because you might want to do that at some point. Maybe if that was really important for me to do, then maybe I would just use a regular for loop. Maybe that's a disadvantage of having the for each. It's going to iterate over all the items, but there might be a way to balance out of it. So again, here you're sort of looking at this sort of mini database that's in memory. You're looking at all these methods. You're getting a little bit of ES6 at the same time. And that's really about it. I want to move on to the next topic. Let me stop this.